Hello everybody, June here. To continue with the 18th century theme that I started with the Francis Rump, today I'm going to show you how I made an embroidered fichu to go with my 18th century outfit. Now, naturally, in the period, this embroidery would have been done by hand, but I do not have the skill, the time, nor the patience to do it by hand. So like a very good 21st century person trying to do 18th century clothing, I just bought an embroidery design for my embroidery machine. And this is something you can do for modern designs too. Obviously, there is one particular seller that I like for historical and sometimes historically inspired designs, and that is embroidery art designs. I can't remember the name, but I will leave the link in the description. It is the same designer, the same digitizer that I use for the 18th century pocket, and there's also a video about that which I'll link here, maybe here. I still can't remember. But anyway, so I used her design, and this design is actually from an 18th century fichu. So she looked at the original and she designed this design based on that. So looks wise, it's pretty accurate. And of course, there is no home machine that can do all of this embroidery in one piece. So the designs that are this large usually come split up into sections, and I'll get to that in a little bit. But this is one of those. It's basically a design that comes in, I think the largest hoop is 5x7, but I could be wrong. So each design each section of the entire design is meant to fit in a hoop that is about 5x7. And so that's what I bought. That's a long story short. And then for my fabric choice, I chose a cotton voile that I've had in my stash for a long time. It is pretty see-through, but not quite sheer like say chiffon. And I wanted to actually make this in silk, but if this was going to go wrong, I would rather it go wrong with fabric like cotton, which is not as expensive, rather than with silk. Now, it didn't go wrong, so maybe at some point one day in the future I might do it in silk, but so far I'm very happy with it in cotton. And one other thing that I really considered was what kind of thread to use, mainly whether I wanted to use regular embroidery thread in the bobbin rather than embroidery bobbin thread, which if you do machine embroidery, you know what I'm talking about. Because both sides of this thing can be seen, right? You'll have it on, but sometimes it might twist or what have you. It's not like in regular embroidery of a garment where one side will always be obscured. There's a possibility that the wrong side of this embroidery will be seen. So I wanted to make sure that it actually looked nice. In the end, I decided to just use bobbin thread in the bobbin because it was also white and it matched my embroidery thread pretty well. So that gave me a lot of headache, but in the end I think I made the right choice. To get started with the embroidery, the first thing you have to do is give yourself some guidelines on your fabric about where you want your design to go. Unfortunately, I didn't film myself doing this, but those blue lines that you see there are my guidelines, and they are about 2.5 inches in from the selvage edge and from the cut edge. Now the cut edge I ripped to make sure that it was on grain. And then after I center my design in the corner, remember that a fichu is a triangle, and that first design that I'm embroidering is a very point in the back. And after I had that marked, I just hooped the fabric and started embroidering the corner. After your first section stitches out, now comes the truly tricky part of all of this, and that is matching your next sections. Here I'm doing a very rough alignment with my template that I printed out in the previous stitched out design or section, just to see what I did to put the stabilizer in the back. So if you don't know this, whenever you machine embroider anything, you have to use some sort of stabilizer. And for this project, I chose tacky Vilene because I could just peel off the paper and attach the stabilizer to the back of my project without having to go to my iron every single time, because I do this something like 10 times in this project alone. That would have just taken a lot of time. So I'm just turning the fabric over, and I am going to just put that stabilizer in there. And it takes more checking and rechecking than I like to admit, but you want to make sure that you put the stabilizer where it belongs and that it actually covers all of your hoops. So, you know, tons of checking. This is not the most fun part of this whole thing, but it is kind of the underpinnings, if you will, of this entire embroidery project. And now you actually have to start matching your designs properly using your templates. You see those little 4s and L's where I'm putting in a pin? Those same guidelines are stitched out in your design. So you have to sort of take a template, a paper template like I'm doing here, and try to align your next section with the previous one in a way that both matches the match points, but also where the design actually comes together so that there are no gaps in any direction. This definitely takes patience, and it's more of an art than a science, but you have to be as accurate as you can. Here's my big head blocking the view. But you have to be as accurate as you can, otherwise there will be gaps in your design. And in this particular case where the scallops actually get cut out, there might be some unraveling later, and you definitely don't want that. So I'm being particularly peculiar here. After I lined up my template with my design in a way that I liked it, I just took some tape to make sure that my template would stay attached to my fabric as I hooped the fabric, which we'll see in a moment. So again, making sure that everything is lining up nicely and then putting on that tape on there. Okay, the tape is on all 4 sides, and now it's time to align that hoop with the design on the template. And then try my absolute best to make sure that the hoop and the template and the fabric all stay aligned as I move the top of the hoop into the bottom of the hoop. And this is a bit of an exercise in futility sometimes, and chances are you will have to adjust it once you actually hoop the fabric. But I guess I was pretty lucky because most of the time it just worked. One thing I found out after stitching my first section is that it is best to turn off the function in the machine where the machine cuts the threads after each little bit of stitching. So it is best to turn it off and then go in and cut them yourself, because it will look cleaner on the wrong side. Now you can see here that my alignment is not actually perfectly centered, although the horizontal alignment that is across the short side of the hoop is centered. The vertical across the long side is slightly off center, but it's off center the same on the top of the hoop and the bottom of the hoop, which is acceptable because then this is something that we can fix in the machine. We can move our design around so that it is centered when we stitch it out. The key here is to not have your fabric twisted. Now I'm just going to tighten that hoop to make sure that it is as taut as it needs to be. And I'm checking my alignment again because I'm obsessing over this. But basically after I am done with the hooping, I will just take this to the machine and stitch out the next section. And you will do this, or rather I did this many times. So you will do this over and over again until you have stitched out all the sections in your design. In my case, I did 4 repeats of the main body of the design. So the design came in the center corner, then the side corners, and then the endless border. So it was a lot of aligning, it was a lot of hooping, and it was a lot of making sure I didn't lose my mind trying to align fabric that had slightly shrunk with all the stitches. But in the end it worked out. As I said, this is more of an art than a science. I want to interject here and say that it is extremely important that once you start stitching out the other side of the fichu, so I started on the selvage side, so now when I was doing the grain or the cross grain section, you have to make sure that you mirror your designs and rotate them accordingly, otherwise they will look different to the ones on the selvage side, or whichever side you started with, it doesn't matter. So mirroring at this point is kind of crucial. So in this particular design, only 2 sides of the fichu are stitched out, and the part that actually hugs your neck is left without any stitches. So after the stitch out was done, it was time to give this thing some shape. So what I did was fold my fabric and match the end point of the embroidery and folding at the very tip of the back, so that very first section that I stitched. And this basically gives me a bit of a triangle shape. It tells me where the fichu needs to end and where I need to cut my fabric. Then using an L square to make sure that everything was actually at the right angles, I drew a line from about 1/4 of an inch up from the end of the embroidery all the way out to the folded edge. And that 1/4 inch from the end of the embroidery is eventually going to be my hem allowance for this fichu. Then to make the piece easier to work with, because we're still not done, I just went ahead and I cut the fabric, I don't know, maybe like 1.5 inches away from that line that I drew. And this line, it doesn't matter if it's straight or not, this is not actually going to be my hemline. It's just so that when I'm doing the next steps, I'm not battling this whole square piece of fabric. And if aligning the design to stitch it out was tedious, this part is tedious and nerve-wracking. So now I am just cutting away all of those scallops, all of that embroidery that I did. And the trick here is to cut close enough that your fabric is not going to shred, because, you know, fabric does ravel sometimes, but not so close that you actually cut into the stitches. And as you can see here, it is a bit of a struggle. I used 2 different kinds of scissors. Both of them were technically embroidery scissors, but they had curved edges. These are really small ones, and then I used some that are slightly larger. But I decided to leave the stabilizer on at this point because I figured that the weight of the stabilizer would actually make it easier for me to cut the fabric, and I was correct. And this is a section that I had already done. Man, I don't think I've ever done anything this nerve-wracking in sewing, to be quite frank with you. And now it's time to hem the neck edge. As you can see from the shadow on the fabric, I still have the stabilizer on in the back, but I made sure to remove as much as I could from the neck edge. And I'm just doing this little narrow hem by hand, which took me forever. I mean, if you were not interested in doing it by hand, you could just totally do a rolled hem on your machine, or you could do a rolled hem on your serger. Honestly, I don't know why I decided to do it by hand, considering that all the embroidery had already been done by machine. But anyway, here we are. So just going to do this hemming until I get to the other side. And the stitch that I'm using here, I don't actually know what it's called, but you basically create a little ladder of about 5 stitches before you pull your thread through, and that rolls your fabric to the inside, creating a very small rolled hem. I don't think you want to watch me hemming this for 3 hours, so we are just going to skip to the next part of this. And then it's time to get rid of the stabilizer. This is wash away, so you want to wash it away in very hot water, and it's very sticky, and you're going to have to actually leave it in the water for a while because it will dissolve, but it will just attach itself to the other parts of your fabric, so you have to wash it away and rinse it really well. At the very end, you want to make sure you trim all your threads and that you have gotten rid of all of your alignment stitches. But that's it, the fichu is done. And here I'm wearing it with a bedgown. It's not exactly fancy, but you get the idea. I love it. So even though I've had an embroidery machine pretty much for like 13 years, this was my first time embroidering a design that required section sew, that required matching. Basically, all of the embroidery that I've done until now has been something that has fit in a single hoop, whether it's a 4x4 hoop or an 8.5x14 hoop or whatever it may be, but it hadn't required so much alignment. And let me tell you, it is a lot of work. And it won't always be perfect. I found that sometimes, rather than use the guidelines that stitch out with the design that you then have to remove, it was easier, or rather more accurate, to match the actual design, so the cutout of your paper design, to the one that you had just stitched out, and butt them up the way that they're supposed to look. Because think about it, the fabric is very thin, and when you are adding all of these stitches, sometimes it kind of doesn't shrink, but I guess it does shrink a little. So sometimes the marking lines, the guidelines, and there's actually a name for that, and the name escapes me right now, but sometimes they don't actually match. And if you were to match them, the design would just sort of start curving and you would end up with like weird shapes at the end. So that's one tip. Another tip, I think in hindsight, I would have used a different kind of stabilizer. I would have used something a little beefier, because even though it looks good enough, I think having the strength of a little bit thicker stabilizer, still wash away, but a little bit thicker, would have maybe prevented from puckering the way that it did. It did pucker a little bit, and it doesn't bother me, but it's there. But other than that, I think this is so cute, and I cannot wait to wear it in September when I go on this event. And thank you so much for watching. I hope that this has been helpful. I will see you next time. Bye.